First things first. If you're familiar with this introduction, feel free to skip ahead until the trigger warning for our racist, hate-filled image of the day appears on screen. Otherwise, let me tell you. In each of these videos, I give away a t-shirt from my website, UnionOfTruth.org. That t-shirt goes to whichever comment in the comment section scores the highest on my double-secret proprietary rating scale, and they'll get to pick whichever design they want from the website. Mind you, I give away a t-shirt if the video gets at least 5,000 views and 50 unique comments by the time I start making my next video. I intend to make these videos 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Official rules are posted just below the like and subscribe buttons. Now, unless you're already fully aware of the following 9 facts, or you have a completely open mind and seek to expand your worldview, these videos might not be for you. Fact number 1. All of our society's root-level structural institutions are controlled by psychopathic parasites who intend to utterly subjugate us. And that's putting it mildly. Fact number 2. No one is coming to save us from them. If we don't take matters into our own hands, we will be utterly subjugated. Fact number 3. We are quickly running out of time to prevent such an outcome. Fact number 4. In order to prevent our subjugation, we need a viable plan of action. Fact number 5. There is no quick fix. A viable plan will need to be very detailed and will require that people must go outside of their comfort zone in order to comprehend it. Fact number 6. As an aspect of its viability, the plan must not require that everyone fully comprehends it in order to follow it. Fact number 7. Since the plan must not require that everyone fully comprehends it in order to follow it, leaders will be needed to properly inform and correctly guide fellow citizens who won't put forth the effort to fully comprehend the plan. Fact number 8. Leaders will need to fully comprehend the plan. Fact number 9. Exemplary leaders are committed to empowering those whom they lead. Exemplary leaders lead by example. And for those of you who are still with me, here's a 10th fact. This book contains a viable plan. The purpose of these videos is to disseminate the information provided in this book and to start an ongoing dialogue about all things related to the plan. You can download a free copy of this book in PDF format from UnionOfTruth.org without signing up for anything or filling anything out. As a matter of fact, I'm hoping you'll take me up on my simple 10-page challenge. It works like this. Read the first 10 pages of the book and fully investigate all of the links that are offered in order to discover the following. 1. Am I functioning from a valid conceptual foundation? 2. Have I done enough legitimate research to qualify as someone whose opinion is worthy of consideration? 3. Does the book actually provide a viable and fully detailed plan to thwart the science of fiction? Quite simple, and certainly not too much to ask of any red-blooded American patriot. One last thing. Those of you who are wondering, who is this guy? Should be sure to check out my video entitled, Who is this guy? Please, let us know exactly what you found most hateful and oppressive about that shocking image. Your feedback is vital to our ongoing mission of greater understanding. All right, in this episode, we're going to go through part 2 of the section called the Federal Reserve. More specifically, we're going to go through part 1 of the dissent that was written for a very important Supreme Court case, Juilliard v. Greenman. The dissent was written by Supreme Court Justice Stephen Johnson Field. This information is of fundamental importance. Please take your time to wrap your mind around this. Mr. Justice Field, dissenting. From the judgment of the court in this case, and from all the positions advanced in its support, I dissent. The question of the power of Congress to impart the quality of legal tender to the notes of the United States, and thus make them money and a standard of value, is not new here. Unfortunately, it has been too frequently before the court, and its latest decision, previous to this one, has never been entirely accepted and approved by the country. Nor should this excite surprise, for whenever it is declared that this government, ordained to establish justice, has the power to alter the condition of contracts between private parties and authorize their payment or discharge in something different from that which the parties stipulated, thus disturbing the relations of commerce and the business of the community generally, the doctrine will not and ought not to be readily accepted. There will be many who will adhere to the teachings and abide by the faith of their fathers. So the question has come again, and will continue to come until it is settled so as to uphold and not impair the contracts of parties, to promote and not defeat justice. If there be anything in the history of the Constitution which can be established with moral certainty, it is that the framers of that instrument intended to prohibit the issue of legal tender notes by both the general government and by the states, and thus prevent interference with the contracts of private parties. During the Revolution and the period of the Old Confederation, the Continental Congress issued bills of credit, and upon its recommendation, the states made them a legal tender, and the refusal to receive them an extinguishment of the debts for which they were offered. They also enacted severe penalties against those who refused to accept them at their nominal value, as equal to coin in exchange for commodities. And previously, as early as January 1776, Congress had declared that if any person should be so lost to all virtue and regard for his country as to refuse to receive in payment the bills then issued, he should, on conviction thereof, be deemed published and treated as an enemy of his country, and precluded from all trade and intercourse with the inhabitants of the colonies. Yet this legislation proved ineffectual. The universal law of currency prevailed, which makes promises of money valuable only as they are convertible into coin. The notes depreciated until they became valueless in the hands of their possessors. So it always will be. Legislative declaration cannot make the promise of a thing the equivalent of the thing itself. The legislation to which the states were thus induced to resort was not confined to the attempt to make paper money a legal tender for debts, but the principle that private contracts could be legally impaired and their obligation disregarded being once established, other measures equally dishonest and destructive of good faith between parties were adopted. What followed is thus stated by Mr. Justice Story in his commentaries. The history, indeed, he says, of the various laws which were passed by the states in their colonial and independent character upon this subject is startling at once to our morals, to our patriotism, and to our sense of justice. Not only was paper money issued and declared to be a tender in payment of debts, but laws of another character, well known under the appellation of tender laws, appraisement laws, installment laws, and suspension laws, were from time to time enacted, which prostrated all private credit and all private morals. By some of these laws, the due payment of debts was suspended. Debts were, in violation of the very terms of the contract, authorized to be paid by installments at different periods,
Property of any sort, however worthless, either real or personal, might be tendered by the debtor in payment of his debts, and the creditor was compelled to take the property of the debtor, which he might seize on execution at an appraisement wholly disproportionate to its known value. Such grievances and oppressions, and others of a like nature, were the ordinary results of legislation during the Revolutionary War and the intermediate period down to the formation of the Constitution. They entailed the most enormous evils on the country and introduced a system of fraud, chicanery, and profligacy which destroyed all private confidence and all industry and enterprise. To put an end to this vicious system of legislation which only encouraged fraud, thus graphically described by Story, the clauses which forbid the states from emitting bills of credit or making anything but gold and silver a tender in payment of debts, or passing any law impairing the obligation of contracts, were inserted in the Constitution. The attention of the Convention, therefore, says Chief Justice Marshall, was particularly directed to paper money and to acts which enable the debtor to discharge his debt otherwise than was stipulated in the contract. Had nothing more been intended, nothing more would have been expressed, but, in the opinion of the Convention, much more remained to be done. The same mischief might be effected by other means. To restore public confidence completely, it was necessary not only to prohibit the use of particular means by which it might be effected, but to prohibit the use of any means by which the same mischief might be produced. The Convention appears to have intended to establish a great principle that contracts should be inviolable. Sturgis v. Crowninshield. It would be difficult to believe, even in the absence of the historical evidence we have on the subject, that the framers of the Constitution, profoundly impressed by the evils resulting from this kind of legislation, ever intended that the new government, ordained to establish justice, should possess the power of making its bills a legal tender, which they were unwilling should remain with the states, and in which the past had proved so dangerous to the peace of the community, so disturbing to the business of the people, and so destructive of their morality. The great historian of our country has recently given to the world a history of the Convention, the result of years of labor in the examination of all public documents relating to its formation and of the recorded opinion of its framers, and thus he writes, "With the full recollection of the need or seeming need of paper money in the Revolution, with the menace of danger in future time of war from its prohibition, authority to issue bills of credit that should be legal tender was refused to the general government by the vote of 9 states against New Jersey and Maryland. It was Madison who decided the vote of Virginia, and he has left his testimony that the pretext for paper currency, and particularly for making the bills a tender either for public or private debts, was cut off. This is the interpretation of the clause made at the time of its adoption, alike by its authors and by its opponents, accepted by all the statesmen of that age, not open to dispute because too clear for argument, and never disputed so long as any one man who took part in framing the Constitution remained alive. History cannot name a man who has gained enduring honor by causing the issue of paper money. Wherever such paper has been employed, it has in every case thrown upon its authors the burden of exculpation under the plea of pressing necessity." Bancroft's History of the Formation of the Constitution of the United States, Volume 2, page 134. And when the Convention came to the prohibition upon the states, the historian says that the clause, "No state shall make anything but gold and silver a tender in payment of debts," was accepted without a dissentient state. So the adoption of the Constitution, he adds, is to be the end forever of paper money, whether issued by the several states or by the United States, if the Constitution shall be rightly interpreted and honestly obeyed. For nearly 3/4 of a century after the adoption of the Constitution, and until the legislation during the recent Civil War, no jurist and no statesman of any position in the country ever pretended that a power to impart the quality of legal tender to its notes was vested in the general government. There is no recorded word of even one in favor of its possessing the power. All conceded, as an axiom of constitutional law, that the power did not exist. Mr. Webster, from his first entrance into public life in 1812, gave great consideration to the subject of the currency, and in an elaborate speech on that subject, made in the Senate in 1836, then sitting in his room, he said, quote, "Currency, in a large and perhaps just sense, includes not only gold and silver and bank bills, but bills of exchange also. It may include all that adjusts exchanges and settles balances in the operations of trade and business. But if we understand by currency the legal money of the country, and that which constitutes a legal tender for debts, and is the standard measure of value, then undoubtedly nothing is included but gold and silver. Most unquestionably, there is no legal tender, and there can be no legal tender in this country, under the authority of this government or any other, but gold and silver, either the coinage of our own mints or foreign coins at rates regulated by Congress. This is a constitutional principle, perfectly plain and of the highest importance. The states are expressly prohibited from making anything but gold and silver a legal tender in payment of debts, and although no such express prohibition is applied to Congress, yet, as Congress has no power granted to it in this respect but to coin money and to regulate the value of foreign coins, it clearly has no power to substitute paper or anything else for coin as a tender in payment of debts and in discharge of contracts. Congress has exercised this power fully in both its branches. It has coined money and still coins it. It has regulated the value of foreign coins and still regulates their value. The legal tender, therefore, the constitutional standard of value, is established and cannot be overthrown. To overthrow it would shake the whole system." Unquote. 4 Webster's Works 271. When the idea of imparting the legal tender quality to the notes of the United States, issued under the First Act of 1862, was first broached, the advocates of the measure rested their support of it on the ground that it was a war measure, to which the country was compelled to resort by the exigencies of its condition, being then sorely pressed by the Confederate forces, and requiring the daily expenditure of enormous sums to maintain its army and navy and to carry on the government. The representative who introduced the bill in the House declared that it was a measure of that nature, quote, "one of necessity and not of choice," end quote. That the times were extraordinary, and that extraordinary measures must be resorted to in order to save our government and preserve our nationality. Speech of Spaulding of New York. Other members of the House frankly confessed their doubt as to its constitutionality, but yielded their support of it under the pressure of this supposed necessity. In the Senate also, the measure was pressed for the same reasons. When the act was reported by the Committee on Finance, its chairman, while opposing the legal tender provisions, said, quote, "It is put on the ground of absolute overwhelming necessity that the government has now arrived at that point when it must have funds, and those funds are not to be obtained from ordinary sources, or from any of the expedients to which we have heretofore had recourse, and therefore this new, anomalous, and remarkable provision must be resorted to in order to enable the government to pay off the debt that it now owes and afford circulation which will be available for other purposes." End quote. And upon that ground the provision was adopted, some of the senators stating that the exigency then existing, money must be had, and they therefore sustained the measure, although they apprehended danger from the experiment. "The medicine of the Constitution," said Senator Summer, "must not become its daily food." A similar necessity was urged upon the state tribunals and this court in justification of the measure when its validity was questioned. The dissenting opinion in Hepburn v. Griswold referred to the pressure that was upon the government at the time to enable it to raise and support an army and to provide and maintain a navy. Chief Justice Chase, who gave the prevailing opinion in that case, also spoke of the existence of the feeling when the bill was passed that the provision was necessary. He favored the provision on that ground when Secretary of the Treasury, although he had come to that conclusion with reluctance and recommended its adoption to Congress. When the question as to its validity reached this court, this expression of favor was referred to, and by many it was supposed that it would control his judicial action. But after long pondering upon the subject, after listening to repeated arguments by able counsel, he decided against the constitutionality of the provision, and, holding in his hands the casting vote, he determined the judgment of the court. He thus preferred to preserve his integrity as a judicial officer, rather than his consistency as a statesman. In his opinion, he thus referred to his previous views. Quote, "It is not surprising that amid the tumult of the late Civil War, and under the influence of apprehensions for the safety of the Republic almost universal, different views, never before entertained by American statesmen or jurists, were adopted by many. The time was not favorable to considerate reflection upon the constitutional limits of legislative or executive authority. If power was assumed from patriotic motives, the assumption found ready justification in patriotic hearts. Many who doubted yielded their doubts. Many who did not doubt were silent. Some, who were strongly averse to making government notes a legal tender, felt themselves constrained to acquiesce in the views of the advocates of the measure. Not a few who then insisted upon its necessity or acquiesced in that view have, since the return of peace and under the influence of the calmer time, reconsidered their conclusions and now concur in those which we have just announced. These conclusions seem to us to be fully sanctioned by the letter and spirit of the Constitution." Unquote. It must be evident, however, upon reflection, that if there were any power in the government of the United States to impart the quality of legal tender to its promissory notes, it was for Congress to determine when the necessity for its exercise existed. That war merely increased the urgency for money. It did not add to the powers of the government, nor change their nature. That if the power existed, it might be equally exercised when a loan was made to meet ordinary expenses in time of peace, as when vast sums were needed to support an army or a navy in time of war. The wants of the government could never be the measure of its powers. But in the excitement and apprehensions of the war, these considerations were unheeded. The measure was passed as one of overruling necessity in a perilous crisis of the country. Now it is no longer advocated as one of necessity, but as one that may be adopted at any time. Never before was it contended by any jurist or commentator on the Constitution that the government, in full receipt of ample income, with a treasury overflowing with more money on hand than it knows what to do with, could issue paper money as a legal tender. What was in 1862 called the medicine of the Constitution has now become its daily bread. So it always happens that whenever a wrong principle of conduct, political or personal, is adopted on a plea of necessity, it will be afterwards followed on a plea of convenience. The advocates of the measure have not been consistent in the designation of the power upon which they have supported its validity, some placing it on the power to borrow money, some on the coining power, and some have claimed it as an incident to the general powers of the government. In the present case, it is placed by the court upon the power to borrow money and the alleged sovereignty of the United States over the currency. It is assumed that this power, when exercised by the government, is something different from what it is when exercised by corporations or individuals, and that the government has, by the legal tender provision, the power to enforce loans of money because the sovereign governments of European countries have claimed and exercised such power. The words "to borrow money," says the court, are not to receive that limited and restricted interpretation and meaning which they would have in a penal statute or in an authority conferred by law or by contract upon trustees or agents for private purposes. And it adds that the power, as incident to the power of borrowing money and issuing bills or notes of the government for money borrowed, of impressing upon those bills or notes the quality of being a legal tender for the purpose of payment of private debts, was a power universally understood to belong to sovereignty in Europe and America at the time of the framing and adoption of the Constitution of the United States. The governments of Europe, acting through the monarch or the legislature, according to the distribution of powers under their respective constitutions, had and have as sovereign a power of issuing paper money as of stamping coin, and that the exercise of this power not being prohibited to Congress by the Constitution, it is included in the power expressly granted to borrow money on the credit of the United States. As to the terms "to borrow money," where, I would ask, does the court find any authority for giving to them a different interpretation in the Constitution from what they receive when used in other instruments, as in the charters of municipal bodies, or of private corporations, or in the contracts of individuals? They are not ambiguous. They have a well-settled meaning in other instruments. If the court may change that in the Constitution, so it may the meaning of all other clauses, and the powers which the government may exercise will be found declared not by plain words in the organic law, but by words of a new significance resting in the minds of the judges. Until some authority beyond the alleged claim and practice of the sovereign governments of Europe be produced, I must believe that the terms have the same meaning in all instruments wherever they are used.
Well, that's it for today. Let's meet back here tomorrow and we'll go through part 2 of Justice Field's dissent. Till then, take good care of yourself and remember, objectivity, logic, fidelity, because absurdity knows no bounds.